Hey guys, tonight we are stepping straight into the world of the Vikings, but not the ones you think. Forget the wind-whipped sea spray and the thunder of longships crashing onto foreign shores. Instead, picture a thick forest of pines, their needles whispering overhead, where the only waves you'll see are the rolling fields of barley, and the only boats are small river craft quietly slipping through marsh reeds. You're about to walk among the Vikings who never saw the sea, the farmers, hunters, and herders who built a world deep inland, far from the taste of salt and the call of the gulls. You probably won't survive this, to be honest, because if the winters don't break you, the bears just might. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time down in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a dirt trail winding through the endless green-brown of spruce and birch, where the land seems to swallow you whole. No roaring tide greets your ears here. Instead, there's the steady hush of wind through branches, and the dull thump of your boots on packed earth. The air smells of damp moss and wood smoke drifting from a distant farmstead. If you think all Vikings were coastal pirates, think again. Inland Vikings lived lives defined by timber, soil, and herds of shaggy sheep. Their days ran on the rhythm of axes chopping firewood, not sails snapping in the wind. This place is so far from the crash and surf that some of its people probably never laid eyes on the ocean, let alone dared to cross it. Instead, they built homesteads ringed with turf walls, growing barley and rye, trading their surplus for iron or salt brought upriver. And while their cousins on the coast risked their necks for loot in distant lands, these Vikings worried more about making sure the winter larders stayed full and their children survived to spring. One mainstream historical fact you might like to remember is that Viking-age settlements in central Sweden and Norway were often miles from the sea, thriving around freshwater lakes and river systems instead. Historians still argue whether that isolation was a deliberate choice. Did they fear the chaos of the sea, or simply love the quiet power of their valleys too much to leave? Either way, their strength came from the land itself, not the water. Here in the pines, the biggest monsters you fear aren't foreign armies or storms, but the lean gray wolves that come prowling at the edges of the sheep folds in winter. These farmers knew every trick to drive them off: sharpened stakes, barking dogs, and more than a few rude curses hurled into the night. The people you meet are sun-browned, bundled in russet wool, and their hands are rough from scythe work, not from hauling ropes on a dragon-headed longship. And yet, these landlocked Vikings still carried the same proud sense of identity. You spot a farmer with a silver Thor's hammer around his neck, standing ankle-deep in barley stubble, who could recite poetry of seafaring heroes he never met. Their worldview was stitched together from rumor, song, and the occasional visitor from the fjords, bringing stories as thrilling as they were impossible. One quirky tidbit: many inland Vikings believed that the deep woods held their own versions of spirits. Housewights, land spirits, and trolls so fierce they made even coastal sea serpents seem tame. Some folks swore you had to leave out a crust of bread on the threshold each Yule, or those hidden beings might sour your milk or tangle your loom threads for the entire season. When you think about it, it was a fair trade. Sea Vikings gave offerings to Aegir and Ran, while the inland folk tried to keep their forest spirits calm. There's a quiet heroism to this life, even if no one ever sang about it around a mead hall fire. These were the men and women who felled timber to build ships they would never sail, who farmed the oats to feed sailors they would never meet. Their hands kept the Viking machine turning, even if no skald thought to make them the stars of an epic. You wander closer to a cluster of timber houses, each one roofed with sod so thick you could graze a goat on it. Smoke curls from the roof holes, drifting into the treetops. Children play in the mud, trying to catch frogs, while an old woman with a crooked back stirs a pot that smells faintly of onions and stale beer. No carved dragon heads here, no precious silver plates looted from Frankish churches. Just everyday tools, everyday chores, and a grim determination to survive. If you listen close, you might hear the faintest hint of longing in their songs at night. These folk knew the ocean was out there, beyond ridges and ridges of granite and fir. Maybe a cousin had left to join a raiding crew. Maybe they'd seen a carved ship passing downriver, headed for the far-off isles. But they stayed, rooted to the same soil as their fathers, tending to sheep, minding the fences, honoring their local gods. And in the hush between wind gusts, you might realize how powerful they truly were. Without these inland Vikings, there would have been no supplies, no trade goods, no surplus grain to support the raiders and kings who made the sagas famous. History so often forgets the people who hold the ladder steady while others climb. But here, in the pines, you see them clearly, and you might just come to respect them as much as the sea kings themselves. You leave the huddle of turf-roofed homes behind, stepping once more into the hush of the forest, where the air tastes of pine pitch and the earth feels soft underfoot. These woods might seem endless, but to the inland Vikings, they were home. And the forest paths were as familiar to them as a sea lane was to a coastal sailor. Here, trails wound through birch groves and marshy meadows, linking scattered farms and trading posts, each with its own distinct rhythm. You pause to watch a group of men splitting spruce logs near a smoky hearth. Their axes bite the wood with a steady, practiced rhythm, sending up a sharp, resinous scent. These men are shaping planks not for ships, but for barns, fences, and roof beams to last through another hard winter. Unlike their coastal cousins, they wouldn't rush to repair a sea-smashed hull. Instead, their worries ran closer to home. Would there be enough hay for the sheep? Enough smoked fish from the lakes? It's easy to think of these inland Vikings as somehow lesser, because no great saga calls them by name. But if you listen closer, you hear their own epics, stories told by firelight about monster bears who prowled riverbanks. Or the summer the barley harvest was so plentiful the gods must have smiled. They had their heroes too. The woman who fought off wolves with a crooked stick, the boy who survived a bitter winter on dried mushrooms, and his grandmother's yarn-spun courage. One mainstream historical fact worth tucking away is that the inland settlements often controlled crucial trade routes. Rivers were their highways, connecting them to distant markets. Some of the best blacksmiths in Viking lands worked far from salt water, forging iron blades and arrowheads that would end up in the hands of famous raiders. Historians still argue whether these trade networks were centrally organized or simply a loose web of local agreements. But either way, the forest folk were vital cogs in the machinery of Viking wealth. There's a quirky fringe tale you hear in a smoky hut. A hunter bragging about catching a giant pike so ancient it had bits of iron in its belly, left over from a lost sword dropped in a river a generation ago. You have to grin at that. Inland Vikings might never see the whales and dolphins of coastal waters, but they spun their own fish tales just as grand. And those river lanes, teeming with pike and trout, acted as silent partners to these people's survival. You imagine a rowboat laden with birch baskets full of char gliding downstream, the fishermen's hands red from gutting their catch, bound for a small market town, where coins clink across a carved wooden scale. The ocean might have carried Viking dreams outward, but the rivers carried them home. As you slip past a grove of twisted oaks, the memory of what you left behind in the settlement stays with you. The mother teaching her daughter to spin wool, the boys playing at wrestling matches, dreaming of someday wrestling a bear instead of each other. There's a comforting normality to their lives, wrapped around the same needs and joys that any human heart recognizes: food, safety, family, laughter, and a place to belong. These inland homesteads, you realize, look nearly the same for hundreds of years. Timber walls weathered to gray, small garden plots lined with poles to keep out the deer, roofs thick with sod, often sprouting wildflowers by summer. Some say you could follow a path from one valley to another without ever stepping out of sight of someone's home. The landscape so thick with farms that the inland world felt more crowded than the lonely edge of the sea. One gentle irony: many inland Vikings still identified themselves as seafarers, even if they'd never seen the open ocean. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was a kind of inherited memory. After all, their great-grandfathers might have built ships for legendary chieftains or fought on coastal raids before returning home. The word Viking meant more than raider. It was an entire worldview, a badge of freedom and fierce resilience. And as you pass another smoke-breathing chimney, you glimpse the twilight glimmer off a woman's brooch, shaped like a tiny longship. It's a lovely symbol. These folk were landbound, but their imaginations still sailed far. In winter especially, stories of wave-tossed voyages could feed the mind like a feast, making the darkness less lonely. A boy waves to you from a gate, holding up a hoop of woven willow. You nod back, reminded that even in a place where the sea is only a rumor, the rolling motion of rivers and dreams of long journeys flow through everyone. They might never have felt the sea wind on their cheeks, but they still honor the shipbuilders, the sailors, the heroes who brought back stories from the edge of the world. And as the light fades behind the pines, you sense something quiet but powerful in these inland hearts, a deep, bone-rooted confidence. They didn't have to cross the ocean to test themselves. Their daily battles against wolves, cold, hunger, and loneliness made them just as strong as any spear-wielding sea raider. If you doubt it, try living here a winter or two, then tell me which Viking life you'd rather gamble on. You rise early, the air still clinging to its pre-dawn chill, and follow the dirt path that twists up toward a wooded ridge. The sounds of morning are already alive, a heron flapping from the shallows of a narrow stream, crows scolding each other in a pine's highest branches, and the occasional far-off thump of someone chopping wood. These are the rhythms of a world not measured by tides, but by the slow unfurling of seasons and the tasks they demand. At the top of the ridge, you pause. Before you lies a patchwork of fields, pastures, and forest, stitched together with fences made of stacked stones and woven branches. Smoke rises from low hearths, dogs bark. A woman in a russet tunic flings grain to chickens with practiced indifference. It's not the sea, but it has its own wild beauty. This inland country with its muddy boots, calloused hands, and quiet strength. Your eyes trace the curves of a narrow river slicing through the landscape like a silver thread. It's here that the inland Vikings built their lives, not on salt and spray, but on soil and patience. Their wealth wasn't looted from foreign monasteries, but coaxed slowly from cows, beehives, and barley. Not exactly saga material, maybe, but the longer you look, the more impressive it becomes. Take the inland women, for instance. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking women, even far from the sea, had more legal and social autonomy than their European contemporaries. They could own land, divorce a lazy husband, or run a farm outright. Out here, that independence was not abstract. It was survival. You didn't wait for a man to come home from a raid when the cow was calving, or the harvest had to come in before the first frost. You reach a clearing where flax is drying on racks, the pale stalks rippling gently in the breeze. A teenage girl lifts her head and smiles, A bit shy, but not startled. Visitors are rare, but not unheard of. In fact, traders and messengers wind through these lands like rivers themselves, connecting distant villages in a slow but steady pulse of goods and gossip. You duck into a low-roofed home with moss on the shingles and dried herbs hanging from every beam. The scent of meat and onion fills your nose. An old man sits near the hearth, carving a comb from bone, while a younger woman stirs porridge and tells her son to stop poking the fire with a spoon. It's a small scene, but you realize this is how most Vikings actually lived. Not in blood-soaked glory, but in warm, smoky rooms full of ordinary effort. There's a quirky tale passed around these parts about a talking raven that only ever whispered the prices of things: fish, wool, iron nails. A merchant claimed it was cursed by a miserly jarl who didn't want his kids to inherit his fortune. The story's absurd, but you love it. It's a reminder that inland Vikings weren't just stoic farmers. They had a wicked sense of humor, too. You follow the woman out to her drying shed, where strips of trout hang in rows. She shows you a skin she's tanning, muttering about how her father used to say good leather was more valuable than silver in the mountains. And maybe he wasn't wrong. Inland trade didn't sparkle like gold, but it was steady. Furs, timber, honey, iron, all of it moved quietly toward coastal hubs, and from there to the wider world. Historians still argue whether the inland communities were seen as lesser or just different by the raiders who made it into the sagas. But what's clear is that inland people knew how to make themselves indispensable. The sea gets the songs, but the land keeps the records. A teenage boy calls to his father, holding up a broken wooden plowshare. It's not an emergency, but you sense how quickly small problems can become big ones out here. A delay in planting, a missed harvest. No raiding party is coming to save you when the ground freezes late or the wolves get bold. The inland calendar doesn't count tides. It counts frosts, thaws, and the lean weeks of early spring. Every moment of labor is a hedge against the unforgiving cold. And yet, as the sun finally breaks over the ridge and warms the stones at your feet, it doesn't feel grim. It feels grounded, purposeful. These people understand something that gets lost when we chase legends: the quiet dignity of endurance. As you return to the ridge path, you pass a carved stone set upright at a crossroads. The runes are faint, but the symbol for protection is still visible, a charm for travelers. Inland people weren't isolated. They were connected in 1,000 hidden ways. Paths through woods, memory passed down in story. A cousin 2 valleys over with good flax seed. And even though they never saw the open ocean, their minds still traveled with the world. A scrap of silk from the east, a rumor of war from the west, a joke told in the dialect of a place 5 rivers away. It's all here, in their daily lives, stitched into the fabric of who they are. So, the next time someone scoffs at a Viking who never saw the sea, think about this. Can you feed a village from an oar? Can you warm your family with a broken sword? Can you sing a song over frozen soil until it thaws? These people could. They did. And that's a kind of heroism, too. The path winds down from the ridge toward a village square where voices hum like bees in a hive. You slip among the people, catching the swirl of homespun cloaks and the clatter of iron-tipped walking sticks on packed earth. It is market day, and inland Vikings, who never smelled sea salt on the wind, gather here to trade, gossip, and argue prices with a seriousness that would impress any raider. Wooden stalls creak under piles of barley, flax thread, smoked trout, and honeycombs heavy with golden sweetness. You spot a tall woman in an indigo kirtle holding a basket of dyed wool as she haggles with a man offering a chipped axe head. Her eyes are sharp, her voice sharper, and you wouldn't want to get between her and a bad deal. Historians still argue whether these marketplaces were controlled more by men or women, but you suspect the answer is yes. Everyone had to pitch in. The sea might have given some Vikings their freedom, but this market was where the real backbone of community showed itself. A child tugs at your sleeve, holding out a clay whistle shaped like a pig, giggling before darting back behind a table stacked with carved wooden spoons. Another boy proudly shows you a polished piece of amber, warm as firelight, while his grandmother waits patiently to swap it for a hunk of beeswax. You pause near a stall selling mead in clay jugs stamped with runic marks, the trader praising each jug as the strongest, the sweetest, the truest taste of summer fields you'll ever find. There's something almost holy about these marketplaces. Not in the sense of churches, but in the way they bind lives together, season after season, need after need. A group of farmers trades jokes about a local goat who once stole a wedding feast right off the table. You grin at their laughter, picturing the goat strutting away with a roasted duck in its mouth. These are the tales that stick around, long after war stories fade. You spot a weathered wooden pole topped with a carved horse's head, the assembly marker where disputes are judged. It reminds you that even here, far from the sea, the Vikings had rules, and those rules could be bent or twisted, but never ignored completely. In these assemblies, known as things, people debated, argued, and occasionally settled disputes with a swift blow of an axe if they had to. Inland justice was practical, but still Viking. Nearby, a group of children tosses pebbles into a shallow puddle, squealing each time a stone splashes cold water on their bare feet. You sense how these children will grow up grounded, the land itself forming their sense of right and wrong. They will measure their lives in harvests, marriages, and the steady heartbeat of the herd, not the wild rolling of the waves. A woman steps out from the crowd, showing off a fine piece of linen dyed the color of autumn leaves. She points proudly to the stitches along the hem, telling anyone who will listen that her grandmother taught her the pattern. That grandmother, you imagine, may never have seen a sail in her life, but she shaped her granddaughter's world every bit as surely as any shipwright. You make your way past a booth hung with iron tools, scythes, awls, and chisels, their edges gleaming. A blacksmith stands behind it, one thumb tucked in his belt, explaining to a young couple how to fix a broken hinge. He looks more at home with the tools of soil than with any blade meant for a raid. It's a quiet kind of power, the power to mend. Historians still debate whether these inland people felt less Viking without ships, but you can see there's nothing lacking here. Their pride grows from the same root, resilience. They just turned it inward, toward survival, toward generations, toward the calm persistence of land rather than the chaos of sea. A pair of older men sit cross-legged on a wool blanket, tossing dice carved from deer antler. One claims they came from a traveling trader who'd seen the great halls of Hedeby. Whether true or not, the story is worth retelling because stories, even little ones, bind these people to the larger Viking world. You leave the marketplace with the echo of haggling voices behind you. The dirt road bends around a thatched barn where a woman is teaching her son to patch a clay oven. His tiny hands shape the mud with unsteady determination, and she laughs softly, encouraging him. Inland Vikings, you realize, have no need for constant storms and horizons. Their horizons are right here, measured by the distance to the next village or the first snow on the mountain. Their storms are those of failed harvests, of harsh winters, of hungry wolves. And their victories, they look like a roof that holds against the wind, or a baby that lives through its first winter. As the sun lowers, a cow bellows from a nearby pasture. You hear the creak of cart wheels, the farewell calls of traders heading home, the final bargains shouted across the square. The energy of the market dissolves, leaving behind a hush, and you feel a deep respect for these Vikings who never saw the sea, because in their own way, they sailed every day just on a different kind of tide. The trail leads uphill now, winding through fir and spruce, past the bleached remains of a timber sled rotting in the underbrush. You climb slowly, pine needles crunching beneath your boots, the forest humming with late afternoon quiet. There's no sight of sails, no gulls overhead, only the rustle of wind through boughs and the faint, persistent chatter of birds staking out territory. Still, you're not alone. These woods hold stories too, stories of people who never saw the ocean, but who carved their lives deep into the heart of this land. At a clearing near the summit, you find the remnants of a longhouse. The walls are half gone, just moss-covered beams and a row of stones outlining where heat once lived. But the view is stunning. Rolling valleys below, dotted with pastures, rivers like silver threads in the evening light. It's here you start to understand something. Not all Vikings were drawn outward. Some looked inward, and they didn't just survive, they flourished. Historians still argue whether these upland dwellers consider themselves true Vikings. But the truth is likely more complicated, because identity doesn't always follow boats. Sometimes it follows blood, memory, or the weight of land passed down through centuries. You imagine a family sitting on this very hill 1,000 years ago, breaking bread, speaking in low voices as the fire crackled between them. No longship, no raiding party, just a steady presence. There's a kind of stubborn dignity in that. These were the people who kept sheep through snowstorms, who shaped charcoal pits out of frozen soil, who learned to read the forest the way others read stars. They might never have shouted on the prow of a ship, but they still shaped the world. One basket of berries, one spindle of flax, one quiet burial at a time. You find an ancient burial mound tucked under a knotted birch, ringed by stones so old they seem part of the earth itself. There's no grand marker, no runestone to brag about glory, just a rise in the ground and a stillness that suggests deep respect. You kneel and brush away some leaves. The grave belongs to someone who never crossed a sea but whose descendants may have, and maybe that's the point. Not everyone has to travel to leave a mark. Nearby, you find something strange, a carved wooden mask half buried in soil. It's grinning, wide and goofy, probably used in a festival or a ritual of some kind. Theories abound about Viking inland festivals. Some historians think they mimicked coastal rites, while others insist they had their own mountain gods, their own wild stories that never made it to the sagas. Maybe this mask was worn by someone dancing around a fire, scaring away winter. Or maybe it was just the medieval version of a practical joke. There's something beautiful about the not knowing, because the more you walk through these woods, the more you feel like the land is holding secrets, not maliciously, just protectively, like a grandmother tucking keepsakes into the folds of her cloak. And if you listen closely, you might catch a whisper or two. You rest against a tree, its bark rough and cool. From here, you can see smoke from a distant farmhouse curling into the sky. Somewhere down there, a family is baking flatbread on a stone hearth, passing around wooden bowls of thick barley stew. You'd trade a week of silver coins for a seat at that table, for the warmth of low ceilings, for a laugh shared without words. And this is what's so often forgotten. Viking identity wasn't monolithic. It wasn't all axes and wolves and storm-tossed raids. For every warrior charging into battle, there were dozens of others back home, growing onions, repairing boots, whispering lullabies into the dark. You think of a young girl learning to spin wool beside her grandmother, a boy mending a fence with his father before the snow arrives. These acts aren't loud, but they are permanent. The thread of daily life, unnoticed by history books, is often the one that holds everything together. One fringe theory you once read suggested that the Viking inland communities had their own oral histories entirely separate from the coastal sagas. They had local epics, stories of snow beasts, stone spirits, haunted forests where ancestors waited to speak. Most of these were never written down. Maybe some scholar will find a scrap of them carved into a loom weight or a bone comb someday. Still, even without scrolls or ships, these people passed on wisdom in songs, in riddles, in the careful teaching of when to plant and when to harvest. And you begin to understand, for all the drama of the sea, there's something almost more impressive about enduring right here, in one place, through centuries of cold, crop failure, and political shifts. A red squirrel darts across your path, chattering like it owns the hill. You offer it a nod of respect. After all, it probably knows more about this land than you do, maybe even more than the rune carvers did. Nature, like memory, outlives most of us. The sun is dipping now, casting the forest in long gold shadows. You pull your cloak tighter, the air crisp with the bite of approaching night. The trees whisper again, but softer this time, as if approving of your journey. You descend slowly, thinking not of raiders or kings, but of root cellars, of mountain herbs dried in smoky kitchens, of stories told to children who would grow old without ever seeing the ocean, and would be no less Viking for it. You follow a narrow track leading toward a wide meadow, where goats bleat lazily under the slanted light of early evening. Their horns glint faintly, and behind them stands a sod-roofed barn, half sunk into the earth like it's trying to stay out of the wind. You pass by with slow steps, the scent of damp hay and wood smoke curling around your cloak. No seawater here, no salt in the air. But it smells like life, just as rich and necessary. This, you realize, is a very different kind of Viking life. Not the kind that charges through monasteries with a roar, but the kind that greets the day with a yawn and a few cracked knuckles. The kind that watches weather more than tides. The kind that survives by staying exactly where it is. You wander toward the barn and pause at the door, half open. Inside, a girl about 12 is mending a net. Not a fishing net, but one meant to catch birds in the trees. She hums to herself as she works, barefoot on the packed dirt floor. This isn't the Viking world you see in movies, but it's real, and it's grounded. These inland communities had to adapt everything, tools, clothes, even gods, to a landscape that answered to snow, stone, and silence. You spot a carved pole at the edge of the field, worn down by wind but still standing tall. It's a landvetter marker, a kind of territorial spirit guardian. Vikings inland didn't always build temples. Sometimes they just marked the land and left offerings there. A smear of butter, a pinch of grain, maybe the last bite of someone's meal. Scholars still argue whether these practices were deeply religious or more like a superstitious insurance policy. Either way, the fear and reverence ran deep. Even without the sea, these people had tides of their own, planting seasons, frost moons, lean years, and fat years. You imagine a family watching the snow come early, calculating how many sheep they could butcher and still have wool in spring. That's a different kind of raid, a raid on your own pantry, trying to outsmart winter with your bare hands. You pass a woman kneeling beside a stone hearth, stirring something thick and bubbling in a cauldron. Her tunic is stained with herbs, and she wears a knife on her belt not for defense but for slicing roots. She glances up, nods once, then returns to her task. This isn't warrior culture, it's survival culture, and it runs on quiet strength. Some fringe theorists suggest that these isolated Viking households created their own microeconomies, part barter, part ritual, part guesswork. A strip of linen might be traded for birch bark honey, or a sack of mushrooms for a carved spoon. No scales, no coins, just trust, memory, and the occasional grudge. A detail catches your eye. A wooden sled stacked with drying fish, far from any visible water. You raise an eyebrow. It's a trade item, brought inland from the coast. Preserved with smoke and salt, it'll last the whole winter. That fish might have passed through 5 hands before landing here. Each stop a tiny link in a silent network stretching across forests and fjords. No sails necessary. You crouch by a wooden fence, watching a toddler chase a chicken with delightful inefficiency. A grandmother, wrapped in a russet shawl, chuckles softly and shuffles after him. You don't need to understand the words to grasp the warmth. The village might be small, a cluster of homes, a well, a gathering hall. But the social glue is strong. Nobody here is alone for long. The gathering hall itself sits at the edge of the meadow, squat and wide, with moss clinging to its roof and a low stone threshold worn smooth by generations of feet. You push open the heavy door and step inside. The air smells of broth, beeswax, and damp wool. Not glamorous, but comforting, the way memories are. A group of people sit near the hearth, playing a game with carved bones and flat stones. They laugh when someone loses, tease with a sharp edge but soft eyes. This is what community looks like without banners or blood feuds. Just time, repetition, and a sense that winter's coming. So, let's be kind while we can. There's a carved bench in one corner where an old man is smoothing the edge of a wooden bowl with a bone file. You watch his hands work. Not quick, but sure. That bowl might feed 3 generations before it's turned into firewood. Objects here don't just exist. They age. They matter. Historians still argue how much inland craftsmanship influenced Viking culture as a whole. Whether these techniques filtered outward into coastal trade routes or remained a secret language of the landlocked. You find yourself relaxing into the quiet rhythm of this place. No clang of swords, no crash of waves. Just the scrape of bowl against file, the pop of burning peat, the occasional giggle from a child. It's slower, yes, but also deeper. The sun dips low outside, washing the meadow in honeyed gold. You step back into the open, greeted by the scent of blooming heather and distant baking bread. You think again of all those who never saw the sea, never raised a sail, and realize they were no less brave. They faced winters with less glory, but more grit, and they endured. As you follow the worn path toward the next hill, you look back once. The meadow glows, still and breathing, as if it remembers every footstep that's ever passed across it. And you suspect it does. You rise early the next morning, stepping through a swirl of mist that curls around your boots like a cat refusing to leave the hearth. The air tastes sharp, clean, and faintly smoky from last night's peat fire. It's quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat, and beyond that, the rustle of wind through birch trees. No rush of waves, no creaking mast, just the calm hush of land that has shaped its people for centuries. You follow a narrow lane that dips down toward a grove, the leaves wet with dew. There, a small group is already hard at work, gathering herbs and roots for the winter stores. You watch a young woman tie bunches of thyme and meadowsweet, binding them with rough twine, while an old man with gnarled hands pulls mushrooms from a mossy stump. Vikings on the coast might measure wealth by silver arm rings, but here it's measured by full storage pits and strong root cellars. One girl holds up a twisted mushroom cap and snickers. She teases the others that if you eat this one, you might dream of sailing to Odin's feast. Or you might just get a gutash. The joke lands well, and the group laughs. You can sense how humor acts like armor here, fending off long, dark winters before they've even begun. Past the grove, you find a long, low building used as a weaving house. Stepping inside, You feel the hush of concentration as half a dozen women work the looms, their fingers flicking through wool threads in a hypnotic rhythm. Stripes of indigo, russet, and saffron catch the light. These woven cloths might one day trade for dried fish, iron knives, or even a marriage alliance, carrying a bit of inland pride out into the wider Viking world. Historians still argue whether these textiles had symbolic meanings woven into them, or were simply patterns chosen to please the eye. Maybe both. A spindle rolls across the floor, clattering to a stop near your foot. A woman picks it up with a sheepish grin, pushing hair from her eyes. You nod back, struck again by how grounded this Viking life is, rooted in steady hands and patient hours rather than the wild gamble of ocean raids. Out behind the weaving house, smoke drifts from a tiny forge where a father and son hammer out iron nails and small tools. Their movements mirror each other perfectly, a silent choreography of skill and repetition. You notice the tools aren't for ships but for carts, fences, maybe a plow. Landlocked Vikings needed no dragon-proud longship. They needed a way to repair a broken gate before the goats escaped. The boy sets down his hammer, wiping sweat with a sleeve the color of dull teal. His father checks the edge of a chisel, nodding approval. There's no grand hall of fame for these two, no sagas to record their names, yet their daily efforts kept an entire settlement alive. You can practically feel the ancestors leaning over their shoulders, proud of simple, essential skills passed on and kept alive. Down the lane, you see a woman carrying a shallow wicker basket filled with eggs, moving carefully so they don't crack. She pauses to greet a neighbor, trading a half-dozen eggs for a twist of spun wool. The transaction is easy, quick, and wordless. A glance, a nod, a tiny smile. Who needs scales and coinage when you trust your neighbors more than any wandering trader? A breeze rattles the woven rush mat hanging across another doorway, and you catch the faintest smell of fermenting milk turned into curds in a clay pot. It might not sound glamorous, but those curds would outlast fresh milk and feed children deep into the coldest month. Vikings inland were nothing if not practical, stubborn in the best sense, willing to twist and bend every resource until it gave up one more ounce of survival. And still they found space for ritual. You notice a tiny stone figurine tucked above a lintel, a woman's face carved with gentle lines. Maybe a fertility charm, maybe a goddess's blessing, maybe just a folk memory turned to art. These small things reveal a faith woven into daily life, rather than kept in one grand temple. Some fringe scholars like to argue that these households were even more devout than coastal raiders, leaning on their local spirits and land gods for everything from rain to safe childbirth. You find that easy to believe. After all, the sea might have offered grand adventures, but the soil decided if you ate or starved. As you leave the settlement, you spot a trio of children playing a game with sticks and a carved wooden ball, their laughter ringing clear against the quiet fields. It hits you then how these kids might grow up never seeing the ocean, never stepping on a ship, and yet still proudly calling themselves Viking. Their courage is carved out of earth and patience, not salt spray and storms. You pause to watch them, and a sudden breeze lifts the edge of your cloak. You feel a strange kinship with these land-bound Vikings, a reminder that heroism doesn't have to wear mail shirts or swing axes on foreign shores. Sometimes it just means hauling water, binding wounds, and hoping the harvest holds out one more year. You take a deep breath of morning air, hearing birds sing somewhere in the birches, and carry those sounds with you as you move forward, ready to explore how faith, family, and land kept these inland clans strong across countless generations. The path ahead dips into a hollow, and your boots squelch through wet earth where a spring bubbles up between stones. You pause for a sip, cool water tasting of iron and peat, and wonder how many inland Vikings had leaned over these same stones. There's a strange comfort to knowing your thirst is the same as theirs, human, practical, and endless. As you climb out of the hollow, you spot a ring of stones laid out in a rough circle. A woman kneels there with a bundle of dried herbs, carefully arranging them while murmuring something under her breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a poem. These ritual circles were common in inland settlements, a place to honor ancestors or call on small gods of field and forest. Historians still argue whether they were true shrines or just seasonal gathering points, but either way they show how belief wrapped around every corner of daily life. Beyond the circle, a cart rattles over hard ground, drawn by a pair of shaggy oxen. Its driver calls out, voice cheerful, as he heads toward a low cluster of wooden buildings. These barns and byres might look unimpressive, but they hold the future: calves, piglets, salted hay. They're Viking fortresses of a different kind, protecting life rather than stealing it. You wander closer, stepping past piles of firewood stacked head high. A young boy helps his grandmother split kindling with a small hatchet. The old woman eyes you with a grin sharp enough to cut bread, then goes right back to her work. That generational chain feels stronger than any sword, binding child to elder, skills to memory. Down a winding lane, you reach the edge of a field being prepared for sowing. A man scatters seed from a rough-woven pouch, while a group of children follows behind, stomping the earth flat. You can't help but smile at the chaos: kids shrieking, dirt flying, and the father only half successfully keeping order. It's a reminder that farming was always a gamble, a prayer to the sun, and a child's game all rolled into one. Moving on, you notice a quiet workshop built from turf and rough timber, where a woman paints patterns on a wooden bowl. Her brush is made of coarse animal hair, the pigment ground from clay and plant ash. You lean over to glimpse spirals and knots blooming under her hands. These designs connect even a simple dish to centuries of tradition. Some fringe scholars claim such motifs protected food from spirits, while others shrug and say Vikings just liked pretty dishes. Maybe it was both. Next door, a low-smoke oven belches out the rich scent of barley bread baking. You catch a glimpse of someone using a wooden paddle to slide fresh loaves onto a woven reed mat, steam curling in the cool air. You can practically taste the chewy crust and imagine the warmth on a freezing night. Inland Vikings prize these breads, proof that you could store grain through the harshest months if you planned carefully. A few paces away, a pair of boys practice wrestling, grinning as they roll each other through dry straw. Their mother watches with a tolerant eye, calling out a reminder not to tear their tunics. The boys laugh and keep going, oblivious to the world beyond the next playful scuffle. It strikes you that courage isn't always on a battlefield. Sometimes it's in how you stand up after being thrown down, even if only by your brother. You follow a low stone fence lined with dried herbs and rushes, brushing your hand over the crumbly, fragrant leaves. There's a kind of memory in these walls, in the way they hold back goats as well as winter winds. Someone built them long ago, and someone will mend them again, as steady and quiet as breathing. Further along, you find a cluster of people setting up for a seasonal feast. Strips of fish are being hung to dry, while others carry mead barrels down from a wagon. Laughter bubbles through the air, and you realize these land Vikings celebrated just as fiercely as their sea-roving cousins. Even without salt water in sight, their parties mark survival itself, the simple fact of another year won. Near the feast tables, you spot a carved post painted in streaks of teal and russet, its head shaped like a fierce boar. It stands watch, maybe to guard the food, maybe just to lend courage. Historians still puzzle over how such household totems worked. A bit of magic, a bit of folk art, a bit of psychological comfort. In any case, they remind you that even landlocked warriors needed their monsters close by, if only to chase away worse fears. As evening draws on, lamps flicker along the lane, made of iron cups filled with fish oil. The smell is sharp, smoky, and oddly comforting, pulling the shadows back just far enough. People drift toward the big hall, carrying bits of song and chatter with them. You trail behind, catching the rhythms of boots on packed dirt and the hopeful hum of a harp. Inside, the same hall that saw grief and barter now glows with warmth. Plates clatter, benches shift, and voices swell together. You settle near the wall, soaking up the smell of roast mutton and the faint spice of juniper. And you marvel, once more, how these Vikings, the ones who never saw the sea, managed to forge an entire world on steady earth, shaping each day with a resilience that feels as vast as any ocean. You wake with the chill still on your skin, though the fire inside the hall burned low hours ago. Morning fog clings to the ground outside, thick as wool, and you step carefully through it as you wander down to the edge of the pasture. The landscape feels softened, almost timeless. And maybe that's the point. In these quieter places, time didn't race like it did along the trade routes or the high seas. It seeped, slow and steady, like mist through a pine forest. You pass a girl tending a tethered sheep, brushing its thick wool with practiced ease. She hums something wordless, and the animal leans into her hands like it knows the tune. There's tenderness here, quiet competence that doesn't make it into saga poetry, but might just outlast it. You get the sense that this, not raiding or royal intrigue, was the heart of most Viking lives. Out beyond her, a man with a grizzled beard kneels beside a mound, pulling weeds from a family grave. The wooden markers are weathered, tilted like tired shoulders. No gold, no grandeur, just carved names and the occasional iron clasp half buried in moss. He pauses when he sees you, gives a nod, and returns to his work. In these communities, remembering the dead isn't a special event. It's part of the rhythm. You follow a path winding past fields of flax and barley, still dewy. A woman gestures to her child, showing her how to pinch seeds between her fingers to check for rot. The little girl mimics her exactly, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Historians still argue whether women in these settlements had real power or simply bore more responsibility. But watching this moment, you realize the line might be thinner than we assume. Knowledge was survival, and passing it down was power in its own right. Near the edge of the village, a pair of elders sit on a stone bench, whittling wood together with matching knives. You overhear them trading tales, half gossip, half memory, of winters harsher than this, or neighbors now long buried. Their conversation skips from weather to folklore to jokes that don't quite translate. One raises an eyebrow when you approach, then grins. "Looking for the sea?" he asks, before turning back to his carving. You shake your head and keep walking, realizing he's touched something true. Even inland Vikings dreamed of horizons. Maybe they never saw salt water or stood on a ship's deck, but the idea of distance still lived in them. Some traveled to markets, to marriages, to far-off farms. Others stayed rooted but sent their sons or daughters beyond the hills, beyond the rivers, into the world their stories painted. Back at the main hall, someone strung fish-skin streamers between the roof posts, decorations for a coming festival. You ask what they're for, and a teenager shrugs. For the new moon. Then he adds, or maybe the harvest. Depends who you ask. The details shift, as they always do, but the celebration stays. It's about rhythm, marking time in a life that rarely offered guarantees. Inside, preparations are underway. Sacks of dried mushrooms, salt blocks, jugs of honeyed mead. A woman stirs a thick stew in a wide bronze pot. wooden spoon moving in lazy circles. You catch the scent of garlic and roasted root vegetables. She waves you off when you try to help, not unkindly, just efficient. Everyone here has their part to play. And when the feast begins, it's not the silence that strikes you, but the sheer noise of joy. Laughter loud enough to shake rafters, songs with melodies so old no one knows who first sang them. Someone taps rhythms on an overturned bucket, and the elders stamp their feet like kids. A toddler climbs onto the table and is only half-heartedly scolded. For a moment, it doesn't matter who owns what land, who's seen the sea, or who's named in any saga. This is enough. Then comes the skald, again, standing by the fire with his wool cloak flaring behind him. This time his story is different. No dragons, no gods. He speaks of a woman who once tamed wild dogs, and a man who lived to 100 and taught each of his sons a different way to fish. There's magic in it, even without spells. The audience goes still, not out of awe, but because it sounds so real, almost like memory. You sit back and realize, the landlocked Vikings weren't side characters in someone else's adventure. They were the anchor, the foundation, the reason the wild edges of the Norse world didn't collapse in on themselves. While ships crossed oceans and kingdoms rose and fell, these people kept the fire lit. They fed the ones who left and welcomed the ones who returned. And in doing so, they shaped the story just as much as any raider or king. The fog lifts by morning, burned away by sunlight and wood smoke. People start to drift back to work, already folding the celebration into memory. Children sweep floors, men cart away bones, women gather herbs for the next meal. Life here doesn't pause long. There's always something next. You head to the edge of the settlement one last time, standing on a ridge that overlooks rolling forest. You can't see the sea. Maybe they never did, but they felt it, in stories, in trade, in the strange trinkets that passed from hand to hand. They knew a wider world existed. They just didn't need to sail it to believe it. And maybe, in their quiet way, they helped hold that world together. The ones who never saw the sea. The air is crisper as you walk down the ridge, and the wind feels almost playful as it snags your cloak, as though urging you to linger one last moment. A trail of chimney smoke drifts through the valley, reminding you that even the humblest fire leaves a mark. Here, in these hidden places, the Vikings who never saw the sea left marks of their own, not on distant battlefields, but in stubborn fields and crowded hearthrooms, where voices rose in arguments and laughter in equal measure. You follow a path through newly turned earth, dark and rich, ready for sowing. A boy digs carefully along one edge, planting onions that will feed an entire family come next winter. His mother calls out warnings about planting too deep, but he seems to barely hear. So intent is he on getting each bulb lined up straight. Historians still argue whether these farmers lived harder lives than their coastal cousins, or simply different ones. But there's no mistaking their skill. Every clump of dirt here holds stories of frost, rot, and sudden bounty. Your boots crunch through dry straw as you enter a small barn stacked high with hay. A scrawny cat stares you down from a rafter, eyes glowing in the gloom. Someone left a wooden spoon on a milk bucket, half forgotten. The smell of old wool, warm animals, and smoke mixes into a strangely comforting perfume. You wonder how many travelers over the centuries have paused in barns just like this, sharing gossip or a crust of bread while storms raged outside. Out in the yard, a child struggles to swing a dull axe against a log. Each chop lands crooked, but no one scolds him. You catch the father's voice explaining how to split wood along the grain, and there's a patience in the tone that feels timeless. It hits you that this might be the true inheritance passed down, not swords or silver, but lessons in how to stay alive, season after season. Later that afternoon, you wander through a wooded path. A pair of girls are gathering mushrooms, dropping them into a woven basket with practiced fingers. They move so smoothly you might think they were born knowing which fungus was safe and which would drop a person flat on their back, hallucinating giants in the trees. A fringe bit of folklore claims certain mushrooms let you see across the ocean if you ate them during the full moon. You doubt it, but the idea makes you grin. Vikings and their imaginations, unstoppable, even inland. Past the girls, you see a rough clearing where an older woman is teaching two teenagers to weave baskets from willow twigs. The young ones complain about the thorns, about the scratches, about their clumsy fingers. The teacher just shakes her head and keeps working, showing them how to twist and flex the fibers until they bend. Nothing comes easy here, and the landlocked people know it. The day wanes, and the settlement returns to its quiet. A man draws water from a stone-lined well. A woman checks the binding on her house's roof beams. A pair of children run along the fence line, screaming about some invisible monster only they can see. You stand there for a moment, taking it all in. The blend of old and new, myth and routine, fear and courage, all woven into one durable thread. Even without sea spray on their cheeks, these Vikings knew how to wrestle the world. A skald passes you with a grin, carrying a new story in his head. Maybe tonight he'll tell a tale of a farmer who dreamed of rowing the Wales Road, or of a girl who claimed she saw a dragon on a ridge and nobody believed her until the dragon burned their goats. The inland people needed stories just as much as any sea rover, maybe more, to remind them their lives had shape and meaning. Because while they never watched a sail rise on the horizon, they still looked outward, curious about what might lie beyond the next hill. You walk to the village edge again as dusk starts its slow creep. There is no roar of the tide, only the far-off cry of an owl and the rustle of wind in pines. That, somehow, is enough. You think about the many ways a person can belong to a culture, not just by blood or battle, but by sharing the same fears, the same comforts, the same stubborn will to keep going even when the world shrugs against you. That, more than any ship, carried these people forward. They may have never glimpsed a fjord or handled a tiller, but their lives rippled outward anyway. They raised the farmers, the craftsmen, the mothers, the dreamers, the singers, the story keepers, all of whom made sure there was a home to return to when the seafarers came back. No hall was empty, no fire untended because of them. You let that thought settle around you like a warm wool blanket, noticing how the last rays of sun slip across the thatched roofs and the fading festival banners. Some candles flicker in the window frames, little lights fighting back the long night. You breathe easier, letting go of the sea-chasing legends for a moment and holding on to this. The Vikings who stayed. The Vikings who endured. The Vikings who lived in the shadow of sails, yet made a life so strong it could hold up the entire North. So now, let your breathing slow. Feel the hush settle over your bones, just as the hush settles over these quiet valleys when the day is done. There's a peace to that, a calm that asks for nothing but your presence, nothing but the gentle thump of your heart moving steady and sure. You might picture the distant sea churning far beyond these ridges, but you do not have to sail it tonight. You can remain on firm earth, anchored like those who never left, whose stories were stitched straight into the soil. Think of those basket weavers and grain hoarders, the children chasing each other between thatched houses, the elders telling tales by embers that refused to die. These are the people who kept the world turning while heroes chase glory. These are the steady voices in the chorus, the ones who made the harmony possible. You can almost hear them now, if you listen. A lullaby without words, passed from fire to fire, season to season. In the end, the giants sleep, the seas rest, and so do you. Your worries can wait for another day. Let your shoulders loosen, let your eyes grow heavy, and trust that the dawn will come, carrying you forward with the same quiet courage these landlocked Vikings held in their hearts. You are safe, you are warm, you are enough, as much as they were enough, simply by tending what was in front of them. Let that thought hold you close tonight. Let it rock you gently toward rest. Good night, traveler,